Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our conversation with the Reverend Dr. Lauren Artress. Typically on a Friday evening at Grace Cathedral, the second Friday of each month, we host a labyrinth walk, a candlelight labyrinth walk with live music. You know, we usually have between 250 and 500 people coming to the cathedral to walk the labyrinth. It's an incredible experience. People always come away from that evening feeling moved in really lovely ways. And the group that joins us in ministering to that community is often doing things like lighting candles before and facilitating and having conversations with people about their experience throughout the evening. It's such a special time. So we've been looking for ways at Grace Cathedral that we might find some virtual space to hold a similar kind of space for all of us gathered. And to sort of relaunch the Labyrinth community in anticipation of regathering in person, God willing, in the near future, but only under the safest possible standards. So I am so over the top excited that Lauren has agreed to share with us about her new book. For most of you, you don't need an introduction. Lauren is something of a legend in the Labyrinth world. But for any of you who are joining us who may not know about her incredible work, Lauren is a longtime clergy associated with the cathedral. She served at Grace for 30 years, and her work in the Labyrinth really pioneered the whole global Labyrinth movement. She began her time as a canon pastor and became canon for special ministries, and her work was so important that the cathedral gave her the unusual distinction of being an honorary canon, which means that she's a kind of canon at large for life in the cathedral setting. It's a very, very rare distinction to be conferred. She is also, of course, author of The Sacred Path. Many of you probably know that book. It's an incredible book, and she's also author of a workbook that accompanies The Sacred Path. Many of you may know that book from work that you've done individually or in communities or in churches, but it's also really, really worth checking out. Tonight, we're going to be talking about her new book, The Path of the Holy Fool. And I am just so delighted that Lauren is here to join us. So we're going to jump right into this wonderful little moment where she's going to teach us about the history of the Labyrinth, the experience of the Labyrinth at the cathedral, and sort of what propelled her to launch this movement.
Great. Thanks, Jude. It's really great to be here. And I'm missing our second Fridays of the month. You know, we would be at beautiful Grace Cathedral with live music. And as you mentioned, many candles lit and many people. So it's almost a year now that we've been not there. And I look forward to returning as well. So, and for joining the Innovative Ministries together, that all your work under Canon for Innovative Ministries is really important. And so my hope is that there's folks from yoga on the Labyrinth and the sound bathing, which sounds wonderful. And I haven't participated in that, but I certainly have online with Vine. So yes, let me give a brief overview, but I have to say, there are a few photos here that I want to share that have never been shared before.
This is exciting.
So I went back into my archives, really looked at this and saw that, wow, I need to really kind of share some of these. So what I'm doing is bringing up the PowerPoint at this point, and I'll share my screen, and we'll start there. Okay. So just a brief overview. And for some of you who are regular people walking on Friday evenings, this is a little bit of a different approach, not much, but I want to make sure that we're speaking about the same thing. And what is a labyrinth and all of that, I think, is important for all of us to get aware of. I want to say, Jude, partly because one of your questions to me, how did this all start? And we were doing a Hildegard. This is a recent painting, 1997, a painting of Hildegard looking at a labyrinth of fire. And the Arthur Ernst, I believe, is the artist. And then this sort of set my imagination going. And this was 1990. So way back when. And then we started working in Canvas in 91. We opened it for Singing for Your Life, the New Year's Eve 24-hour event. This is the Dean Alan Jones right there walking it. Our musicians come and are singing by the Labyrinth. So we started in canvas form. We had so many people coming that we decided and needed to have the Labyrinth open more hours. So this actually is hauling in a 900-pound rug. And this was called and is called the Tapestry Labyrinth. And this is one of the photos I've never shown because of the look on my face. Oh my God, what am I doing? What have I done? And this is the late Tammy Heinel there with me as well. So, and here we are. This is Tapestry Labyrinth spread out. And one of the funny things, Jude, that happened when this Tapestry Labyrinth landed at Grace Cathedral, it was delivered 3 weeks early, believe it or not. Commissioned for the cathedral, and instead of Grace Cathedral, the address said Space Cathedral. Kathy Kirkpatrick got a huge kick out of that. So here we are. This is the Tapestry Labyrinth. It's 100% wool rug. It also became later on, this was the second Friday of the month, and maybe some of our listeners were there, but it became a way of blessing other canvas labyrinths that were going out into other sites. So this is an example of the group doing that, kind of laying on hands and blessing this labyrinth as it goes out. Here we are in 1995, the outdoor labyrinth, which is terrazzo of stone at that time. Here we are blessing that labyrinth, and I am the officiant, and here's obviously Dean Alan Jones and the chapter in those times. And the congregation loves, as we know, those kind of things. And also I want to point out that the labyrinths don't have to be just for walking. They can be theater, they can be centerpieces. And this, I don't think you were here, Jude, at this time when this is the Dragon School. We're celebrating Chinese New Year, and the kids are all learning how to be dragons. And so here they are dancing on the outdoor labyrinth. And then this is the final stage. I would call this stage 3 of the labyrinth. And this is what people are familiar with. And we walk on the second Fridays of the month and surround with candles. It's limestone and marble labyrinth put in 2007. And just the beauty of it, just the artistry of cutting the stone and placing the stone. It was really phenomenal to watch. This is the center of the labyrinth. And of course, the petals are symbolic of each different phase. We can talk about that if someone has a question about that. Here we are with the wonderful, I'm not remembering the installation, but the wonderful ribbons, prayer ribbons as well. This is one of Lars Howlett's photos. Here we are, the Dream Quest. This is just, we'll talk about one of the innovative memory ministries as well. This happens yearly when we can, with no COVID, but you can see planet Earth in the center. And Judith Tripp is leading a lovely ritual at this. Here we are, yoga on the labyrinth. I love this photo. I love this photo, partly because it's so colorful. And here in the center of the labyrinth is a musician playing. And again, this is a Grace Lights. So one of the photos from that. And I don't know how many people got a chance to participate in that. And I hope it picks up after COVID. And this is one of the outlines of the outside garden labyrinth. And then it's now in granite outside of Grace Cathedral. And that is open, Jude, right? That's there and available 24 hours a day. And so if we needed to do socially distancing, just be wise and let other people complete it. I wanted to include this because, again, most people have never seen this. Here we are, Bill Swing, retired bishop, Alan Jones, retired dean, and this happens to be Francois Legault, who is the dean of Chartres Cathedral. And he visited, see, I think people need to understand that the Chartres Labyrinth has been closed for about 250 years. And so he and this dean here, Francois Legault, became friends of Alan and myself. In fact, they were described as brothers separated at birth, and it fits. So it was he who was dean of, this is Chartres Cathedral. And folks, if you haven't been to Chartres, put it on your bucket list. And Veritas will return there when we can, when it's safe to return. We're hoping September of 2021 as well. And this is the labyrinth there. This was put in the floor in 1201. So it's over 800 years old. And this is actually looking down at it through the key, what they call the keyhole from the roof. And what you see on the right and left are the pillars of the cathedral. Here it is, Lars, this is one of your photos too, Lars Howlett's photos of the center of the labyrinth, because people walk into Chartres Cathedral and say, I didn't see a labyrinth, where's a labyrinth? And you don't see it because it's covered by chairs. And the chairs both helped it become forgotten and also protected it. And here we are with the chairs removed, walking the labyrinth, seeing people. Now it's open on Fridays. A lot, maybe partly, but a lot because of our relationship and friendship with them. And they're also discovering the use of the labyrinth there in Chartres Cathedral. And here we are in Grace Cathedral, because showing this, I love this and how important this was. This was in 2008, and it's called Eyes Wide Open. It was an exhibit to demonstrate how many lives are being lost in the Iraqi war and the wars in the Mideast. And here again, the Chartres Labyrinth, this is how we light it and can't put candlelight around it when we're using it for our private events at Chartres Cathedral. Now, you know you're doing something right, Jude, if you start seeing cartoons about your work. And so the cartoons over the years started, appearing and all. And so here's one, Mr. Chambers incorporated an idea poll into the design of his labyrinth. So those of you making labyrinths or thinking about it, here good old Mr. Chambers has decided to put an idea poll in. Here's another, rhymes with orange, this Hilary B. Price's. You can see that on the right and on the left, if you really look closely, the little kind of creature, a snail, is a maze, and it's so hard finding your true path. And those of you who walk labyrinths know that a labyrinth isn't a maze. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. A labyrinth is something that has a meander pattern through it. It's one path. It's trustworthy. You find your way to center. Now, you have to focus, as you know, Jude. You have to kind of focus your thoughts and your eyes. But a maze is designed for you to lose your way. And a labyrinth is designed for you to find your way. And then there's one other cartoon here. It's a tough day at the labyrinth. So I've never seen anybody in that shape, but I thought the cartoon was cute. So, and one of the things, this is a wonderful creation by Catherine Anderson, and who does a great deal of soul collage work. I co-teach with her in Chartres. And I like this image because the labyrinth can lead to something else. The labyrinth is a simple way to be able to quiet the mind. Why? Because you just follow the path. Or if you're using a handheld labyrinth, which we're doing a great deal now, and we have a free event on Fridays through Veritas every Friday, it leads to something else. It quiets the mind, it opens your heart, and the simplicity of moving your body as you're following the path, or moving your hand, but especially your body, your mind quiets so much easier. And that's what makes it a really great tool for the monkey mind of the Western world, because most of us really, for the most part, are not in charge of our thoughts or our imagination. And we can talk more about that. We're going to bring up the Grail Castle, Jude. So here's a wonderful, I think, painting. This is from an Argentinian artist, Mauricio Martinez, and he saw a labyrinth. He never walked a labyrinth down in Argentina. And it set off a period of painting, about 250 paintings, very much like this. But the Grail Castle is an invisible world that becomes visible to us if we're in that wonderful, wonderful liminal realm where we meet our muses. And so we can talk more about that. That's part of the Grail legend. So let me stop here. And actually the next photo, yeah, Lars, you're going to put this information into the chat about how to get Holy Fool. So I'll just simply skip that now. Okay.
And I want to commend the book to everyone. I've always been able to engage Lauren in the ministry on Friday evenings. It's been one of the great blessings of my role as being Canon for Innovative Ministries at the Cathedral. And we are so privileged that she continues in her role really as leader of that ministry. But I didn't know what an amazing writer she is. And there's so much beautiful prose in this book. If you haven't, definitely get a copy and read it. I was so impressed with the opening story. Lauren, you began with this beautiful story, this image of a young girl who's just fresh back from visiting the zoo with her grandmother, and she's creating this imaginary creature in her mind, and then something happens. And I want to invite you to tell us a little bit more about that story and why you begin your book with that particular anecdote.
Thanks, Jude. Yes, and that actually happened. The grandmother's a friend of mine, and she was driving her little grandchild. And of course, the grandchild's in the back, about 4 or 5 years old. And, they start imagining this wonderful animal because it just came from the zoo. And then, there's a flurry in the back seat, and the grandmother sort of, and she inquires, and what's happening? And the little girl has thrown a blanket over her head. And so the grandmother asks, what's happening? And she goes, shh, I'm in my imagination. It's a sweet little story. And I start with that because one of the important things about living a spiritual life is really to be able to focus and work and be present with our imagination and to know what we're imagining and to hope, that's the subtitle of the book, to utilizing the labyrinth to focus your visionary powers. Because the imagination is working for 24/7. And we really don't pay too much attention to that. But who does is the advertising industry, the gaming industry. Our imaginations are mental real estate that we need to take charge of. And so that's part of why I wrote the book, because the labyrinth helps focus the imagination. If you were a trauma therapist, it would be called sensory integration, that we can become grounded. We're grounded, we can have a grounded spirituality when we're grounded in our bodies, and then the imagination finds a home.
I love that, and I love that you just you took up that the beginning of the second question, which is really like the tagline is how the labyrinth ignites our visionary powers. And at the heart of your analysis is this thing called the Grail Engine. And I think for many of us tonight, that language might evoke things like of a literal holy grail and maybe like Indiana Jones or Monty Python. But as you explain in your book, you're drawing from a much richer source tradition. Can you just share with us what that is and how it shapes and structures your thinking around recovering imagination and all the work that you're doing around thinking about how that relates to those cultural forces you just mentioned?
Sure. I thought that too. I thought, Parsifal, who's the main character of one of the branches of this complicated story, was kind of just old, country bumpkin, which I identify with. I mean, this Parsifal story turns out to be closely to my own, frankly. But at first it was like, and then I opened the book called The Grail Legend by Emma Young, and later, because of her death, Maria van France. And they call the Grail Legend an eternal fairy tale. And it's like, wow, an eternal fairy tale, gosh. And so as I kind of scratch the surface deeper and deeper, it has amazing roots and controversial roots. There's scholars who think it comes from the Byzantine Mass. There's others who, talk about it coming the Mideast. It's actually most likely, and this is what von Franz feels, it's early oral Celtic stories. And so therefore it have early roots way before Christianity. And then I started, as I kind of reading this, it's a story that comes into our culture the very moment in history that labyrinths were put into cathedrals. Most labyrinths went into the French or European cathedrals between 1170 and 1230. And so there's this window there. And the Grail stories started being collected in the early 1200s. And it happened in France, Christian Toes, as well as in Germany, Wolfgang Esterbach. And I use his version. And so I heard this story told at the Labyrinth Society in 2005, and then loved it, got really into it more. And then a friend, just all of this is synchronicity, mailed me a book called The Speech of the Grail. And it's the Parsifal story. And of course, Parsifal has to learn through his own journey to ask the right question at the right time. And the question is one from the heart. It's an empathetic question to the ailing king. But one of the things, my hunch is, and I kind of offer this or suggest this in the book, that it reconstructs the metaphor instead of being higher and higher every day, more perfect in God's eyes, to the journey, that we're all on a journey. And if we're conscious, if we're aware and become aware, I mean, it's a process, obviously, then we can participate, and we actually, most of us then become holy fools. If we're awake, alive, and conscious right now during this time, it takes some courage and takes some risking, and that's what a holy fool is.
That's such a helpful explanation. And I love that idea of shifting from sort of a classical notion of sanctification to something that feels more like it's process oriented and more in line with, I think, most people real lived experience. You raise in your book one of those really important sort of elements of thinking about lived experience. You talk about these two powerful forces that can act upon the imagination, trauma and dissociation. And you also talk about how one sometimes and often leads to the other, and explain about the importance of knowing how to distinguish between emotions and feelings, which I found really compelling. I think most of us probably don't even think about that. When we're thinking about returning to this experience of wholeness, of a personal process that leads to wholeness, how did those elements integrate? Can you share more about why that's such an important feature of your vision for trauma and restoration?
Yes, and I come to this as a pastoral counselor and psychotherapist, and those are very important dynamics, and that's what's rattling around in our culture right now. But the difference between feeling and emotion, let me start there, because feeling is long-term. Feeling is what we value. If we value the earth, if we value one another, it's a much more deeper gut lived experience. Whereas emotions are like clouds going through the sky. And we confuse those because people, who do not venture into their inner world, are pretty maybe even naive about what's going on inside. And that's part of it, sorting out the feelings from the emotions. And I use the example of, somebody, you're in an emergency room in the hospital and the doctor comes out and has to inform you that you just lost your loved one in a car accident. And the emotion is rage and I'm going to sue you and you did the wrong thing. And, when there's no blame except a terrible accident. And so I love that phrase from the movie, The Interpreter. Revenge is a lazy form of grief. And grief would be the feeling, revenge would be the emotion. So sorting those out, Jude, come on back in here and focus me a little more. That's one important point right there.
And I love how your book explores how not doing that work has really profound ramifications for us personally, but then also collectively. And you do such a beautiful job of acknowledging that the imagination contains this shadow side and sort of warn against. I love that language of feeding the wrong wolf, one of the phrases that you lift up in your writing. Can you name some of those places in our society today where you see that playing out?
Oh yes, let me give a little more background because it's actually quite a famous story in the recovery movement and 12-step programs. The grandfather is struggling with himself and says this to his grandson about, he has a battle going on. He's an indigenous person, which I think grounds that even more. I have a battle going on inside me between good and evil. Between two wolves, one is good, one is helpful, one is loving, one is hopeful, and the other is revengeful and evil and all of that. And so feeding the wrong wolf. And see, that's the imaginative process. Rumination. You can choose which wolf you feed. And on a spiritual journey, you want to become aware and conscious of which wolf you're feeding, and kind of dig a little deeper and see what are you massaging, into reality. And see, I think, and that's really a huge problem right now. A holy fool really addresses and steps out for the goodness of people and the hopeful visions and the healing of community and the caring for one another and all of that very important direction we need to go. But if you're feeding the wrong wolf, and I think, white supremacists and people who are so filled with hate and anger, and are stirred by other people's hate and anger, leads us all collectively to deep, deep trouble. But I also think it's because they're traumatized. And maybe early trauma that just, then you throw some gasoline on that early trauma, and then you get folks who feel victimized and hurt and wronged and misunderstood, and that's what we're up against right now.
I think that's such an important thing for us to remember in our kind of political life as we're thinking about people in very objectifying terms. I love how you really do invite us to rediscover our humanity between each other through this process of acknowledging the fact that we are broken, we are incomplete. That's not a bad thing. It's part of a broader process of recovery, of exploration, renewal, and I'm just thinking, in the face of the challenges that we see, things like QAnon, the kind of Facebook echo chambers that have resulted in some of this really destructive behavior. Where are you finding hope these days? It's the year of healing at Grace, and I wonder what an imaginal healing process might look like on a large scale. And are there instances in your really extensive travel and work with the Labyrinth where you see that potential being unlocked, where you might see an application for the Labyrinth right now?
Yeah, well, let's start with the Labyrinth, because I think that's one of the powerful things that happens on our second Friday of the month. You get 300 or 400 people in the cathedral, and then say 50, 60, 70 people walking the Labyrinth. If we facilitate, so we're spacing people. But you actually can look around and see, wow, I'm walking the path with these folks. It's a great metaphor, and it's true. We're walking the path together. We're walking together. And then in that instance, walking a Labyrinth together, really crystallizes. And it's always very gentle. It's in candlelight. It's soft-eyed. So I think that's a helpful metaphor and a way for people to be able to see. It was Auden who says, everybody needs two kinds of art: and entertainment art and parable art. And the Labyrinth is a parable art. It's the parable of, we're walking the path together, we're being thoughtful, we're being quiet in the sense that we're engaged in an activity that is healing. So starting there, Jude, when we started this at Grace Cathedral, and Grace Cathedral is the place that the whole Labyrinth movement started. And it was named that by the New York Times in a front page article in May of 1998. And now we have 6,000 labyrinths registered on the Labyrinth Locator. And we can let people know about that. You can just Google Labyrinth Locator. It's also on the Veritas website. In 88 countries. Isn't that interesting? 88 countries. And so that's one of the hopes that I carry, is that, okay, that this is a unifying tool. It's a unifying tool. I tell in the book about the woman who came to Grace Cathedral, and she was angry with her friends, and she was going to toss them out of her life after her Labyrinth walk. And it was a Sunday morning, and I remember her kind of stomping around the Labyrinth. And then a couple other people were in the Labyrinth, and it's like, and she started kind of seeing that, wow, not everybody sees things like I see things. Oh, and started realizing that her anger at her friends was, she expected that they should agree with her for 100% of the time. Otherwise, they didn't understand her. And so walking the labyrinth and seeing people from different angles, different times, and it became a montage for being able to soften and see, like, okay, I've got some reflection to do here in my life, instead of going home and tossing her friends out of her life.
Love that. I think that's, again, such a wonderful way of framing the labyrinth as a tool, as a spiritual tool, thinking through what we face in terms of our understanding of polarization and division. And I just think of all the actual applications for the labyrinth, how many of those labyrinths have sprouted up around the world in places like prisons, and schools and hospitals, centers of healing and rehabilitation and restoration. Your work, other people's work with the Labyrinth movement in South Africa around coming to mutual understandings and processes of forgiveness and reconciliation with apartheid. Just such a wonderful beacon of hope, I think, for the moment that we find ourselves in. Are there specific stories or memories you have of things like that you want to lift up right now, or that you want to share with us?
Well, I will say that in 2012, I went to South Africa at an invitation to St. George's Cathedral right in Cape Town. And this is where they were throwing mustard gas and gas bombs, and right in the middle of the apartheid. And, it just started there. And here they have this beautiful 11th Circuit medieval labyrinth, just like Grace Cathedral. It's outdoors, was put there by the dean. And his name is Colin Smith, and I don't think he'd mind. He's the late Colin Smith. I don't think he'd mind telling his story, that he was in the midst of great upheaval in their congregation. Here it was, they're in the aftermath of apartheid. That had been settled with the Truth and Reconciliation, and yet South Africa was going through all that. And he happened to be a gay man, and they found that out. And this is, before 2012, and he was decided to take a sabbatical time, and so he came to Grace Cathedral, and he walked the labyrinth at Grace Cathedral with this great conflict: should I leave? Should I leave? Should I leave? I got to get out of here. No, I don't have to get out of here. Am I in danger? Whatever, all of that, in this very still ruptured country, and and he just heard, this is what he heard: stand your ground. Mm-hmm. Now that's been tainted with negative stuff of, I'm going to stand. No, stay at the cathedral, be there, be present. And I think that's part of it, Jude, is that if we can find the courage to, like Amanda Gorman said, be the light, step into it and be it to one another. And I think that comes from, using spiritual practices. And it may or may not be the labyrinth. Certainly yoga is another strengthening practice for sure. Sound bathing, I've done that in other forms. I haven't done it at Grace Cathedral. But practices to really are usually cumulative when they're working for us. Mm-hmm. They strengthen more and more and more each time we do it. And that's an important element of any practice that we use to be able to strengthen ourselves and get clarity and calm the imagination so it's in sync with the body.
I think that's like the perfect segue to the next question, which is, I love this image that you have in the book about unsealing the orders that life has for you, of kind of your higher purpose, your what we might call a vocation, almost like in the Christian tradition. And there's such an imperative around that image of unsealing orders. There's like an urgency about it. And it makes me wonder, what is at stake for you in this quest, and how is your own life's journey with the Labyrinth, from that process of discovery to founding the nonprofit, Veritas, to really, growing this entire global movement? How has that informed your understanding of unsealing our orders and people tapping into that potential to really discover what is that they love, what their passion is, and how they want to live in the world and move into the world?
Yeah, it's been quite a journey for sure. That quote comes from Soren Kierkegaard, which I use in the first book, Walking a Sacred Path. And every human being comes to earth with sealed orders. I love it. because there's this big rumor out there, another big lie, right? That life has no purpose and that we're not here for anything. It's just random, all of that. Oh my heavens. When you start really, looking within and finding a spiritual journey, you realize, no, we each have purpose and we need to find it. And so that's the urgency perhaps against this, oh yeah, when life is random, it really doesn't have any meaning. For me, it's been an amazing journey. And I'm very grateful to Grace Cathedral because it's supported it all the way. Alan Jones being the dean, in fact, he went over with us, the 6 of us from Grace Cathedral congregation in 1991, early 91, August 91, and helped move the chairs. And there were 256 chairs on that labyrinth at that point. And I remember I didn't sleep the night before, and I thought, oh, it must be just jet lag. And then later, after we moved the chairs, it was kind of cataclysmic kind of event that happened of opening the labyrinth. And it's been open occasionally. I know BBC did a movie, a video on the whole cathedral, and they moved the chairs and things like that, but not for walking. And then coming back to Grace Cathedral and being able to kind of say, okay, let's try this. And what I discovered was you don't have to know what you're doing. I think it's important. I find that's important for people to realize. And, thank heavens the colleagues in the chapter were thoughtful and respectful of this kind of unnamed passion that I had. That was kind of, I'm doing this and doing that. And I was just doing it. I didn't have any kind of, I can't do that. I can't do that. No. And we, we're down on our hands and knees in Gresham Hall painting the labyrinth, on canvas the first time, and it's a little squawking sewing machine sewing together this 42 feet of canvas. It was really amazing. And then, I tell the story in the introduction that Don Lattin comes, who is the religious writer of the Chronicle at the time. And he comes over and we kind of in Gresham Hall do this little kind of mini walk with 20 people or so, and he interviews people, and and he's going to write an article because we're going to announce the opening of the labyrinth at Grace Cathedral with Singing for Your Life with Bobby McFerrin. And the first year we had about 5,000 people, whatever, in the 24 hours. And then I got cold feet. This is the only time oh my heavens, what am I about to do? And it's like, oh, and I called Don Lattin. I said, don't print the article. And he says, too late. It's going to be in December 19th. And I remember like, oh my God, it's December 19th. It's Friday morning. I got to go to the door with dread to find the paper. And it wasn't on the front page. It was about page 4 or so, and a beautiful picture of the canvas labyrinth. And it was named A Path to Enlightenment. And that was the first time that I had a gestalt of what I was doing. And of course, that's his understanding, but I remember saying out loud, wow, I'll sign up for that. And that sort of started it. But I see a lot of people stopping themselves from doing what their really deep nudges are pushing them to do, because they don't know what they're doing. And there's that wonderful quote I found in waiting to do a labyrinth talk. Please excuse the inefficiency of my work. The nature of it requires such a high degree of complexity that I simply don't know what I'm doing. And a lot of people stop doing what they are called to do because they don't have the big picture. And you just keep, and that's the beauty of the labyrinth too. It teaches you just put one foot in front of the other and just keep doing that. And the big picture will appear eventually.
That's so powerful. That you sort of alluded to this in a number of other answers, but you do write so beautifully again about that somatic connection between the labyrinth and healing and self-discovery. And at one point, you're really quite vulnerable. You share a story about your trauma that you suffered when you were very young, and how that kind of propelled you onto a life journey that would ultimately lead to sort of rediscovering the labyrinth. Will you share with us a little bit about what that was like for you?
Yeah, and I won't share the exact incident. I mean, it's good to read the book, but but early on, and I think this is true of a lot of us, and maybe people who are propelling and announcing hateful thoughts and all now, that we can get knocked out of our bodies quite easily. You know, you can have a car accident and, you know, just feel like you're in shock and floating along, and that's okay for a day or two or a week, but you really want to be connected to your body. And that's what happened to me, is I got kicked out of my body quite early. And so it's sort of like you're feeling like you're in a spacesuit, kind of walking along, but you're not directly connected to anything. I talk about, you know, as a therapist working with children who have been traumatized, that you ask them to draw a picture of their family at dinner. And usually the perspective, if they're out of their body, the perspective is from the light on the ceiling. You know, here's mom and here's dad, and here's the, you know, it's from this view down. And it's really important to be connected to your body. And that sounds sort of strange, I'm sure, for people who haven't had that disconnection. You know, you don't need to worry about it. But if not, if you do have it, you don't know it, because it's like, you know, having poor eyesight and sitting in the back of a classroom in fourth grade and not being able to see the blackboard, and you don't know what you're seeing is what you're seeing. You don't know, you know, it just is, until some sensitive teacher helps and then notices that you're squinting. You see, so that connection to the body is so important. And then that's when, Jude, that's when the imagination can go rampant and go out of control. And, you know, we talk about in the Grail legend, the wounded Fisher King, you know, and the wound is a male wound, and, you know, and he's ailing and he's in such pain. And sometimes if people are in pain, pain is a good sign. But if you're knocked out of your body early on, you don't have any pain. You have numbness, but that's not experienced as pain. See, so disassociation, you know, that's what it leads into, disassociation. And I think that is one of the major things we're struggling with culturally now, is that, you know, people don't feel connected to each other. They don't care about one another as much as we need to care about one another. We're disconnected from the earth. You know, we just are kind of floating out in space, and to be able to bring in our sensation. That's why working with the Labyrinth, you can, you know, do breath exercises, you can do a repeated phrase, a mantra, any spiritual practice that you've learned in another form can fit into the Labyrinth as a way of coming back into your body.
That's like the perfect segue into the next question, which is just thinking about movements right now for liberation, for justice, that are emphasizing the reality of people's trauma in their bodies. I think about the Me Too movement, where women are really saying, you know, this conversation has been happening for decades, but truly our bodies are our own, and that needs to be respected. Black Lives Matter saying, you know, our bodies have been treated like so much collateral damage in the policing system of this country for decades. You know, there's so much mistreatment and frustration and anger, and it's all kind of this, when there's reassociation, it feels like that can be a point of enormous release of energy in a good way, but also create a lot of chaos in the process. And I'm wondering, you know, the dominantly white church, the mostly white yoga community is kind of looking at itself, holding up a mirror and saying, you know, how can we do better in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, these really important goals that we all have. And I'm wondering, is that conversation happening in the Labyrinth community, and sort of what's your hope for the Labyrinth community's future around those things?
Oh, that's a great question. And I have a lot of hope, partly because, like, for instance, Lars Harlot, who's working with this webinar tonight, really started speaking up a couple of years ago about, hey, what about diversity in the Labyrinth community? And so we have now a social justice committee on our Veritas board. The board is studying and doing the inner work of social justice as their book that they're really looking at. I think what's so important is, why is it so hard to say that we've been unconscious in this area? I mean, I would use the word racist, but that's not helpful. We've all been raised in a bubble. Everybody has a little bubble around their head. Sometimes it's bigger, sometimes it's smaller, and bubbles bump up against each other. And why can't we learn in those moments? But instead, when white people are unconscious, we keep re-wounding the people who are, not in our bubble. And so the main thing is to educate, to study, to talk, to discuss. And then our scholarship program at Veritas, we offer scholarships to people who are in underserved communities. And that seems to be actually working quite well because especially if they're connected to an institution where they can put the Labyrinth to work right away. It's going to be a long road, but I do think we have made some slow progress in the sense that we are more aware of it now.
Absolutely. I've even noticed a shift in our walks on Second Friday. I know that you've cared about this for a long time. You've been passionate about how do we bring as many people into this experience because it is such a gift. It is such a helpful modality for everyone to access. And I'm so grateful to be part of that work with you. And I just commend the work that you're doing around that. I think it's so important. I want to maybe pivot the last question I have before we open it up to everyone else here. I love that you named some holy fools at the end of this book that is all about the holy fools. That's really helpful for me. There are some that kind of stuck out to me that seem really obvious, St. Francis and Jesus. I want to know sort of who are your favorite holy fools maybe throughout history and who are some people that you see right now locally, state, nationally, globally, who you think are really shining this light for us?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mentioned in the book Mary Clear, and it kind of sorted through, she started Incredible Edible and planting food in public places in Scotland, and now it's actually a worldwide movement. And I like it because I like what she does because it pulls together the 4 areas. In the book, I encourage people to start envisioning. If we don't have a vision, we perish. I mean, that's right there in front of us all. And proposing the vision of Earthrise. In fact, I just found a poem by Amanda Gorman, who read at the inauguration, called Earthrise. And it's exactly the Apollo 8, vision of the green-blue planet out there, Earthrise. And and the 4 tenets of Earthrise, that we really need to become ecologically aware and really, really open up and be conscious on that front for sure. Participatory spirit, for sure, being able to bring communities together is just so important. But I would name, I love Nasruddin from the Sufi tradition. He's a holy fools. There's many different varieties. I might think of Elon Musk, but I'm beginning to feel he's more of a visionary and for profit, and a holy fool isn't necessarily for that. But Nasruddin, he sits in the square, just to tell a brief story. He sits in the market square, and he's sitting there with a basket of hot peppers. And he keeps tossing the hot peppers into his mouth and yelling, "Oh my God, these are so hot. This is terrible. Oh, this is terrible." And he tosses more in. "Oh my heavens, this is terrible. They're so hot. They're so hot." Tosses more in, tosses. And finally, the people gather around him and says, "Nasruddin, why do you keep eating them?" And he says, "Because I'm hoping for a sweet one." And that's such a good lesson. I mean, don't we do that? We hang in with habits because we think they're gonna change or something, and we keep hurting ourselves, but out of the hope that, that something else is gonna change.
That sweet one's coming.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, I mean, I think there is actually a character and was in history like that from him, Nasruddin, but he's one of my favorites. He's not contemporary, but yes, he is.
Contemporary enough for sure.
Mhm.
So we have a bunch of questions here in our little Q&A box, and I think Lars is monitoring the questions on the Facebook
Okay.
chat as well. There's one question about how is the Labyrinth being used in the homeless community? Do you have some insight into that, Lauren?
Mhm. Yes, it's important work. It's not happening everywhere, but there's a few facilitators. We train people. Veritas trains facilitators to work in the communities in which they're in or live near. And so people are working with homeless. Where the Labyrinth is quite effective is, unfortunately, these folks have to line up for meals.
Mm-hmm.
And so walking a labyrinth, and usually they're temporary labyrinths, or usually they're quickly made on the grass, often classical labyrinths, because the shard is more complicated to make. And then people walk it while they're waiting.
Mm.
And sometimes one group has to give people tickets, so because otherwise they won't step out of line. But if you have a number, then okay, I have a number now, so I can go walk the labyrinth. So it's not happening everywhere. Just like prison work, there are labyrinths in prisons going in more, but it's slow work because it takes special people working in special communities.
That's so helpful. Actually, this is something I didn't know, so I'm learning with your questions as well. Thank you everyone for asking your questions. There's another really great question here, which I love because it's such a practical question, and it's something I think everyone who approaches the Labyrinth asks at some point, which is about when you're on the path and you reach the center, do you stop and return the same way, or do you just walk out? And this is something you always address in our trainings and our Labyrinth 101. So do you want to share with?
Sure. Sure. Usually you would turn around, you take your time in the center that you need and move over, make room for others, because there'll be many in the center, at least at Grace Cathedral on our second Fridays. If you find a labyrinth on the locator that's outdoors, you might be there alone. But usually you turn when you're ready and follow the same path back out. But as you become more familiar with the labyrinths, you use it the way it fits you. As you know, Jude, I describe myself as a failed meditator. And I have the feeling our listeners, if we saw their hands, a lot of people would be raising it. But that means I failed at sitting meditation. You see, and walking meditation for me and for many people is far more effective. But so you make it in your own, but the return path, you usually follow that. That means if other people are walking it, you would be meeting them on the path. So right now with socially distancing and our sheltering in place, you might want to walk out the back of the labyrinth, meaning your path comes in, you stay in the center, and then you continue the same direction, just going out the back.
Mm. That's so helpful. There's another question here that actually comes full circle in our conversation about how do we honor children and their imagination, their experience with the labyrinth, and how do we get parents on board in that process? She asked if we have some stories around this.
Well, kids love the labyrinth. Kids love the labyrinth. And I remember two stories. One little girl was in the labyrinth, and I think with other kids, I'm not sure of that, but she was imagining herself on a swing, because, the labyrinth give rhythms, right, left, 28 times going in, 28 times coming back out. And so she had this swing feel, and she was on a swing. She was imagining herself, she goes higher and higher, and the feeling of almost touching God or being much closer to God. That was one sweet story that I tell on Walking a Sacred Path. Another confounded a mother who went to a church for an appointment. She left this, I think, an 8-year-old boy out walking the labyrinth, or it was in the church, I think. And she comes out because it just took a few minutes, and he didn't want to come out of the labyrinth. And then he did come walk it out, and then he says he wants to walk it again. And she says, well, why? Why do you want to, why? He says, because I'm having a conversation with God and it's not finished yet.
That's awesome.
That's pretty bold, isn't it? Yeah.
That is.
Yeah. Kids love the Labyrinth, and it doesn't have to be, it does draw out the spiritual nature of children. It does. And, kids might run it the first time and run it the second time, and then they can settle down and be with it. So we have a lot of people that we train working with kids in schools and daycare and all different centers.
We always see children running the labyrinth, the outdoor labyrinth at the cathedral. They're like having little races with each other to the center. It's like one of my favorite things. Another thing that comes to mind is like, I want to say 3 or so years ago, a mother and her daughter who just kept returning each month, and they had both gone through a trauma recently, but it was one of the only spaces where her daughter felt safe and could actually open up and just, like you always talk about, experience your experience and literally sit with that trauma and not feel like there was any need to do something, but just to be with it, which it turned out was really powerful for both of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that experiencing your experience, I'm glad you raised that, Jude, because that's what makes it a mindfulness practice. Mm-hmm. That you're present in the moment. We define in the book, I define a grail. A grail, and I think the Labyrinth is a grail, not the grail that Parsifal is so searching for, but it meets you where you are and gives you what you need. And the third element is it forms an invisible web of relationship between individual destiny, those sealed orders, and service to the planet. And there's a catch there. It meets you where you are and gives you what you need, but what it asks you to do is be present in the moment and experience your experience, not the experience you think you're going to have, not the experience you should have from your expectations, but what actually is happening in the moment.
And then here's another question. This is a pretty particular question. Someone who visited a medieval church in Denmark where they were restoring some painted Bible stories from the early Catholic era and painted over during the Reformation, and that there was a labyrinth painted on the ceiling. He asked, have we found this in other churches, other older churches?
I wonder how big it was, because there are church bosses, where the vaulting comes together and there's a boss, a circle. I've seen labyrinths either painted or carved into those church bosses, and they're probably about 6 inches around, maybe a little larger. But I don't know about that. If that person has a photograph, mail it to me. I'd love to see it. So, okay. Yeah.
He just did exactly. So.
Yeah, and Lars can put that in the chat.
Yeah, Lars, are there any other questions we have from the Facebook chat that we might lift up here in our final minute or two before we close out our time?
One person asked if you knew if Francois Legault was still with us on the earth. She said she went with you to Chartres Cathedral many years ago.
Great, yes. Francois is, as I understand it, he's still with us. He is in a nursing home with lots of congestive heart failure issues and things like that. So I've been thinking about him a lot lately, but as I understand it, he still is on the planet, and he's a dear man. He's a very gracious, he was against the Labyrinth and had it and insisted it would be closed in Chartres Cathedral until he came to Grace Cathedral and saw the ministry. So I owe him a lot. He's a wonderful man.
And someone else asked if you had advice for introducing the idea of a labyrinth to their congregation.
Gosh, not that I can do in a minute, but start a Labyrinth project. And if you can, come to training. We're doing training online now. And that would be a great place to start, because we spend, 2 days or 4 days online in shorter sessions, really grounding people in how to do that. And that would be through veritas.org. And I think you probably put that in there already, Lars.
Yeah. And one other question is, do you know the artist of the Hildegard painting you shared at the beginning?
I can look that up, but I think it's Arthur Ernst, ERNT. And it's a 1979 painting. And I don't know how it floated into my life, but it was like, talk about imagination, direct connect. There it was.
Well, thank you all so much for being with us tonight. Thank you for sharing this space with us. And thank you, Lauren, for writing this book, first of all, and for spending this hour with us. It's such a blessing. And I cannot wait for us to be back in that space, back together. But this is a wonderful way to reconnect in the meantime. Thank you.
It sure is. Thank you so much, Jude, for doing this and having this. It was really my pleasure. So I'm delighted, and I'm delighted for your listeners to connect up in any way they want to. So thank you.
And don't forget to continue checking veritas.org and gracecathedral.org for updated information about Labyrinth walks as they become available, hopefully in the future when the whole vaccination process really gets underway.
And Jude, if it's okay to mention the Friday finger walk on 12 noon or 4, go to the Veritas website. It's every Friday, free of charge, no cost.
That's awesome. Thank you for reminding me, Lauren.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jude.
It's so great. Well, we love you all. We can't wait to be with you again in person. Thank you so much, Lauren. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, Jude. Thank you. Good night, all.
Good night, all.
Bye-bye.